Good morning, everyone. How are you? Last time I taught a class, it was middle school students. But you all will, no, actually, my middle school students, despite what you hear, were actually very behaved. They really get a bad rap.
Well, don't expect that of adults.
And nobody went and sat in the back of the room. That was sort of amazing.
We had one other person that I think she probably ran down to do something.
Sure, no, that's fine. And I'm gonna ramble a little bit before I actually start here, so they won't miss anything. Welcome, great to have you here. Let me give you a little background before I actually start into this. I was Senator Radcliffe's only grandson. His two immediate brothers had no children. So literally, and my brothers and sisters all died at a very young age. So I sort of was in the position of being the only one that knew him. And my dad passed away in 2009. Bob, knew my dad well. And my dad was cut of the same cloth as my grandfather. I don't think I am, but I am who I am. Being the last one alive that knew him and having not only the knowledge of his personal life, but the information that was left behind. My grandfather, one characteristic of him is that he was a hoarder. He never threw anything away. When we went to clean out his house when he died, there was a room we called the hat room, and there was a room we called the shoe room. And the hat room had every hat he had ever owned. And the other room had a room with every shoe that he ever owned. I don't know. He burned all, the refuse in the fireplace. So obviously, he did not contribute any landfill in any way. But the good side of that is that he never threw anything away. We had every Christmas card he ever received. We have every letter he ever received and a copy of every official letter he ever wrote. So from a historical point of view, he's probably the most documented person in existence. It took me 10 years to go through, after my dad died, to go through everything. I'm still not done. There's still 50 crates up in the Maryland Historical Society. I know what's in them that I just have never been able to go through. Yeah, actually, do you think I gotta turn my phone off? We're gonna be informal, so. So I kind of felt the responsibility to put it all in writing. And I'm talking to Bob, my dad so much wanted to document it. I love my father dearly. He was an incredible lawyer and citizen, but my dad had this problem where he couldn't say no. Until the day he died, he was doing favors for people, legal favors, and he never had time to write this all down. So it really fell onto my shoulders. My background is teaching middle school science. Middle school science teachers don't usually write history books. And I was a little terrified to take that on. And also, if you went back and could find anyone who taught me English in high school, they would say I was the least capable person of ever writing a book. However, the book is there, and I'm very pleased with it. And I spent enough time on it that I think I really caught the gist of who he was. The other issue I had in writing a book on your grandfather is, can you remain objective? And my father talked about writing things down. You cannot be objective about your parent. There are too many things that have gone on. With my grandfather, he lived with us at times. I never lived more than 2 blocks away from him. Spent incredible amounts of time with him. Interestingly enough, the one topic he never talked about until finally, towards the end of his life, I asked him, he never talked about his political life. This is a book about a United States senator, but as you will find, that's not what he should be remembered for. He was a good senator. He's not going to be in the Senate Hall of Fame, and he'd be the first one to tell you that. But his accomplishments outside of his senatorial life were pretty amazing. If you had asked him to put 10 things in his life he was most proud of, he would not put, his 12 years in the U.S. Senate, which makes it sort of interesting. So what I'd like to do is, I've given a couple presentations on the book, and this is not a presentation on the book, because why would you sit and listen to me for 4.5 hours when you can get the book and read it at your own leisure? What I'd like to do is make this more interactive, particularly as time goes on. In part one, I'm basically going to cover his whole life, except for his time in the U.S. Senate. Just to give you an overview of many things that a lot of people are not aware of. He was involved in some incredibly significant things in Maryland on the Eastern Shore that, because he's been gone for years, have long been forgotten. That will be me doing too much talking, and I don't like that. Please interrupt for anything. If you want to get up and stretch your legs. Like I said, I taught middle school, so I'm informal is my middle name. The second session, we're going to get a little bit into a little bit different flavor if you're up for it, because what we're going to deal with is political life. And in dealing with his political life, I can objectively present the facts, but there will be things which you will cringe that he did, and there'll things you'll be absolutely amazed and impressed. So, and I'd also like to kind of look at how a man like that would fare today, which I think makes sort of an interesting comparison, because, the question I'll ask, would George Radcliffe be elected to political office today? And that'll make for some interesting feedback and discussion. I'm still learning about my grandfather. And one of the things that I found as a teacher is that I often learned as much or more from the people that I was quote unquote teaching as, they learned from me. I'm always looking for different points of view and whatnot. Part 3, I'm going to talk about my grandfather and race, and how his views on race, actually, you'll find out, I don't know his views on race. I can tell you how he voted, I can tell you things that happened in his life. I never once, in my 25 years of knowing my grandfather, ever heard him make any comment in reference to race or any ethnic group that was remotely derogative or even complimentary. He just didn't talk about it. In writing the book, there's one chapter, where I deal with this, and basically my conclusion is I have no clue. He was born right after the Civil War, and then made it right through the race riots and civil rights legislation of the 60s, and died in 74. But that's an incredible span, and if we look at how the nation looked at race over that period and how it evolved, and compare that to him, I think it makes sort of an interesting discussion. So, I think we'll enjoy talking about that, and I particularly love to hear other points of view, because as you'll find out, I can present the facts, and I'm going to try to remain objective. There'll be a couple points where I'll add a warm personal touch, because there are things that I knew about the man that obviously no one else knew, because I knew him as a person. So anyway, let's roll. And the clicker.
I'd just like to make one comment.
Please.
I read the book. It's well written. It's very well written.
If it is well written, it's because I hired an editor from the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, and my wife Jackie, who wanted to be here. My wife Jackie wanted to be here, who's been married to for 52 years. She's my rock, but she also, has helped me edit everything. I should have got a second book that's literally coming out this week. I learned very quickly, you can't write by yourself. You've got to get a lot of help to do it. But Jackie would like to have been here today, but they're taking the roof off our house, and we have 2 beagles that are absolutely going crazy. So she is home listening to nonstop barking. I'll probably have to peel her off the floor when I get home. Okay, here we go. So, we're basically we're going to talk about his roots. That'll be a little bit boring. I'll try to, but his background and his ancestors are fascinating. And they sort of, and they intertwine, as you'll see, into Talbot County also. His parents, you had to understand his parents to understand who he was. Growing up in Spocott, and you all are part of the tour, we'll actually get to go down there and see all the real deal, because the house and everything is still there. And we'll talk about that at a later date. His education, which was unusual, the March of Dimes. He was an incredibly important figure in getting the March of Dimes off the ground, and you'll see why that happened. If you ask what he was most proud about other than family, he would say his historical preservation projects, and you'll be kind of amazed at some of the things that he was connected with. His civic engagement, I will venture that he is probably the busiest human on planet Earth, even when he was in his 80s, and you'll see. And he was a very different kind of a person. I know he was my father's inspiration, and both of them are my inspiration. If I turned out at all well, it's just because I had 2 incredible moms. Early Dorchester County. Some of you probably are less familiar with Dorchester County, and there's some parallels between early Dorchester and early Talbot. Dorchester County this is a map of it in 1877. One of the things about Dorchester County that I guess people don't think about now is at that time and before, it was completely isolated. It might as well have been, well, it was almost like a big island. It had obviously the bay to the west, Choptank River, which there was no bridge then. You've got the Nanticoke River on the other side. So really, if you lived in Dorchester County, you were really out in the middle of nowhere. And, you also were surrounded by, flies and mosquitoes, because Dorchester County, even then, was about 50% marsh. It makes it incredibly unique. That's why birders from all over the state always head down to Dorchester County. Talbot is wonderful too. I'm a member of the Talbot Bird Club, and, real close friend of Wayne Bell, and who I realize his sons, of course, is here. But it's a really kind of unique environment. And, my grandfather, of course, grew up in that environment. It was settled early, actually settled earlier than Talbot County in many cases. Most of the settlement was on the islands, Hooper's and Taylor's Island, which are still there. They're disappearing. However, like you all have, Tillman is now protected by Poplar Island. They're going to rebuild Barren Island down there because things are disappearing fast. I have ancestors that are buried in cemeteries on islands that are gone. So they're out there somewhere. But that's where the early settlement was. And of course, if in Dorchester County, you had to operate by boat, so you needed to be near the water. The Neck District, which is actually where I live and where Spocott is, so you'll be there in a few weeks. If you've never been there, sort of unique because it's like a little peninsula, and a lot of the early settlement was there because there's obviously ready access to water. Probably not terribly different from anywhere on the Eastern Shore, but particularly true in Dorchester. Obviously, there was farming. The issue with farming is that how are you going to sell crops to anyone else, because you're basically out in the middle of nowhere. So you also, almost every farmer was a shipbuilder, and of course a lot of people lived off the water because there's no place in Dorchester County where you're more than a quarter of a mile from navigable water, which is sort of unique. My grandfather's ancestry, there'll be a quiz at the end, so make sure you get all this information. I guess the point of this is a lot of people came over early. A lot of his ancestors came over early, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them. And if you look at the history of Dorchester County and probably come up with the 10 most significant figures, 8 of them were his ancestors. So he had strong family roots, and you're going to see the significance of that. The first Radcliffe was Richard Radcliffe, who actually settled in Talbot County, but that's not where he was headed. He followed William Penn to Philadelphia because he was a Quaker. And, a couple months after Penn basically settled in Philadelphia, he headed over on a ship, but they ran into a major storm, ripped the boat apart, and then the captain apparently was paid to deliver them to the eastern shore, not to Philadelphia. So the poor guy ended up in Choptank and ended up in the Easton area. He was a member of the Third Quaker Meeting House. But he sort of broke off from the Quakers. There's a story where the Quakers literally sent someone out to try to get him to come back, and he pointed to the sky and said, "This is my church right here." So he was a little bit different.
What's the submission? You have that?
Oh, that was the boat. I'm sorry, that was the boat that he came over on. And he was 21 and came over by himself. I could go on and on about him, but then we never get to my grandfather. So, but thank you. Do that, please. And of course, some of my ancestors populated the islands. He's descended from Captain Henry Hooper, first settled in Calvert. A lot of people, and of course, ended up on Hooper's Island. Hooper Island named after him. A lot of the early settlers in Dorchester County were basically asked to leave the Western Shore. Maryland was set up, in the spirit of religious toleration, but by the late 1650s, that was changing, and Quakers particularly were not welcome. And a number of the early settlers in Dorchester were Quakers, so there's a tremendous amount of settlement in Dorchester from about 1659 through 1670. And I guess putting up with the flies and the mosquitoes was preferable to putting up with people that didn't like Quakers.
So who would it have been that gave him the 400-acre tract?
Good point. Let me partially answer that with another ancestor. And I'll get to that in a second, but great question. We also had a Jamestown connection. One of his ancestors, and my great-grandfather actually married a Beckwith, came over on the first supply mission to Jamestown, and they left in, a few months after the settlement, and they were on the Phoenix, and it was lost at sea. There were 2 boats. One came in, and they actually had a funeral service for everybody, and then all of a sudden they showed up in the spring. They'd been blown off course by a hurricane, and they made it. So it just interesting backgrounds to all these people. This is the one I want to talk about, and this will answer your question, Ben. The ancestor that settled Spocott, and you'll get to see Spocott, and it looks not dramatically different than what you see right there. He fought in the Royalist army that put Charles II back on the throne after Oliver Cromwell. And so he was held in high favor by the king, but also Lord Baltimore was basically set up a policy that if you transport people from England over to America, that he would reward you with land. So it was a combination of those 2 things, and Stephen Gary was given a grant, and actually several grants, but one grant to develop Spocott. It's a 250-acre piece of property, which you'll get to see, and I can honestly say the family didn't pay a cent for it.
Is it still 250 acres?
It is still 250 acres, except for what's eroded. And for what's going underwater because of rising sea level, and I'll give you a historical / environmental tour, because in looking at history, you really can't ignore the environment, because the environment so much plays a factor in how things happen. But he was given this land grant. He was apparently a character. He got in trouble himself, but he was still sheriff of Dorchester County. And the house has been owned by one of my ancestors ever since Stephen Gary was there. The left side of the house that you see was actually built in 1663 or shortly thereafter. So it is one of the very oldest houses on the Eastern Shore, if not close to the oldest. Nobody's ever given me an exact answer. So he had these amazing ancestors, and you'll see how that plays in. Yeah, let me go back. What I'm going to do, because it can be, I personally, I guess I'm probably was what they call ADHD in school, that, I could only sit so long, and, don't just give me a monologue, because I'll go to sleep on you. And I sort of like things that are more interactive and flexible. But what I'm going to do is, if you look at my grandfather's early life, there are 15 clues that if you didn't know how he ended up, you could look at those 15 clues up to about age 17, 18, and you could literally predict how his life would play out. And that's what's sort of interesting, is that he was described as one of the shyest kids anybody ever knew. And to think that he would end up being this significant senator, public speaker, dynamic person, it just makes no sense. But if you see the things that sort of steered him in that direction, it makes it kind of interesting. I find it, kind of neat. Like I said, he was born in Dorchester County. Spocott had been the site of a major shipbuilding operation. He was child number 19. And I'll talk about that in a second. It's a picture of Spocott around 1900, and it doesn't look dramatically different, except that it's a little bit better kept up. His mother was a fascinating woman, and you have to sort of understand her. She was one of descended from one of the prominent Taylor's Island family. Her father was a shipbuilder. His wife died at a very young age, and he did what was sort of unusual at the time. He swore off marrying anyone else for the rest of his life, just to be a father for his 3 daughters, and apparently was just, an incredible man. She married and had 6 children with this Andrew Jackson Robinson. He died, and you'll see very quickly married my great-grandfather. She always stayed connected to Taylor's Island. She, because of her family history and background, family history was incredibly important to her. Her father built a little Episcopal church that's on Taylor's Island, and she drilled family history into my grandfather's head his entire life.
Excuse me, George.
Yes.
So that's how your family became Episcopalian initially?
Yeah, that would probably, because my great-grandfather was actually a Methodist, so I guess my great-grandmother would have been Episcopalian, married Methodist, and my grandfather, I think, ended up Episcopalian. So religion was kind of secondary in a way. They were religious people, but they valued, more mundane things. Her family history was kind of incredible, and this is where the passion. And this is kind of clue number 1. The stories that my grandfather heard about his ancestors were unbelievable. This one ancestor, referred to as grandmother Polly Travers, literally was a War of 1812 hero. After the British burned Washington, they landed on Taylor's Island. to pick up supplies. They burned a lot of houses. They were looking for gold. She hid the family silver under a setting goose, a goose that was nesting. Everybody else put their stuff in the outhouse because they figured the British would never look there, but that's the first place the British would look. But nobody was going to mess with a mama goose sitting on a nest. But her husband and his ship and a number of the people on the island were captured and taken aboard the Marlborough. That's actually a drawing of the actual ship. And we actually have, somehow they came up with a picture of her, which is sort of amazing. She rowed out, she and a neighbor rowed out to the ship, and she single-handedly took on the British captain. And after a series of negotiation, everybody was free. She got the ship back, and the commander actually gave her a silver teapot. I'm glad I don't know what she did to get the deal, but apparently she was referred to as a very persuasive person, and that may have been an understatement. These are the stories that my grandfather heard. I mean, and rather than bedtime stories, he was told stories of his remarkable ancestors. So obviously family history and history were going to be important. His father was interesting. He was, descended from Quakers here. He was captain of the Cambridge Blues during the Mexican War. He purchased Spocott, which is actually owned by a sort of a distant cousin, and his first wife married. He had 10 children, and his wife died in 70. So when he married Sophie, his 10 added to her 6. I guess that was an early, yours, mine, and ours. And then they had 3 more children. He was a shipbuilder, very prominent shipbuilder. He built 2-masted, spelling mistake. Oh, nasty. Bad. 2-masted schooner at Spocott up until the Civil War with his 2 brothers. And you're going to see how that played out. These ships sailed all up and down the Atlantic. One supposedly circumnavigated the globe. Incredible shipbuilder, but it stopped at the Civil War, as you will see. Once again, the large family. That's a picture of some of the family. Era's pointing at my grandfather, but he did have 2 brothers. Both lived in Dorchester County. Sewell, who I knew was a farmer, completely different from my grandfather. Very outgoing and very not so much rooted in history. More, my grandfather was more likely to talk about, grandmother Polly. Sewell was much more likely to talk about, the error that somebody made in an Oreo game the night before. His other brother, Thomas Broom, who I didn't know, who died early in my life, and he was Cambridge postmaster. But neither of them had children, so Spocott was a unique place, and we'll talk about this a little bit too on the tour. There were a number of families that lived there. It was completely self-sufficient. Other than they had to barter for nails. They made all their own clothing. They made their own shoes. It was apparently a really unique kind of place. But my grandfather great-grandfather had an open door policy, which was kind of unique. It was actually sort of written up and documented that anybody that showed up at his door was welcome to come in for a meal and stay the night. Anybody, didn't care who they were. And so the house was always crowded. So my grandfather got to meet a lot of people. And, if you were willing to do some work, you could actually stay for several nights. And, that's how a lot of work got done and whatnot. So it made Spocott kind of a different kind of place. It wasn't, I've heard a couple of people refer to Spocott as a plantation. Very much not that way. Also, there was not money involved.
But they were Quakers? No, they were.
At this point, he was a Methodist. And of course, the Methodist Church split in his lifetime, and the Southern Methodist Church course, was a little bit, not so much pro-slavery, but not anti-slavery. So we're not really sure where he sits, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the third session. But, so my grandfather grew up in this really kind of unique environment. My great-grandfather was an abolitionist slave owner. Figure that one out. This was not unusual for Dorchester County. There were actually, in the 1850 census, there were more free blacks in Dorchester than there were slaves. But, one of the things that we've done is sort of corrupted history and tried to fit everything in nice little boxes. My great-grandfather doesn't fit in a nice little box. He had slaves when he purchased Spocott. We know that there were 14 of them in 1860. Most of them were children. So obviously it wasn't an economic reason that he was holding on to slaves, because feeding the kids probably, outbalanced anything that they were getting in terms of labor. He never formally freed them, but he always claimed they were free to go. But particularly in Dorchester County, maybe less so up here. In Dorchester County, if you were a slave and not a property owner, you're probably going to be arrested and sold down south. So, and then this is where, in my opinion, rather than fact, I just have a feeling that the slaves that were there were comfortable enough and more fearful of what happened, what would happen if they were free. Once again, we're going to dig into that a little more deeply because I have a little bit more information. We know he was abolitionist. In Churchy, he got up in the early 1850s and advocated everyone free their female slaves and was kindly asked to leave the church. This is actually a picture of, and you'll actually see his house on the tour, Columbus Wheatley. Fascinating character. Once again, he was a slave, but he lived his entire life. Yes.
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you, but.
No, that's okay.
When you say the church asked him to leave, at which point was this? Was this a Methodist church?
This was the Methodist church.
Methodist.
Yeah, he was always he was a very religious man, but to him, religion was, I'm getting off the subject, but that's great. I love getting off the subject. My grandfather said that he would, every morning he'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and he would, from 4 until 6, he would think. Occasionally read. He was a prolific reader too, but I guess, and this fits in a lot of our family, and I guess I'm kind of that way too. He was asked to leave the church, but to him, religion was more of a personal thing.
Was he asked to leave because he had those 14 slaves, or was he asked to leave because
of the statement, because of asking people to free their female slaves? That was not the Neck District was very much of a pro-slavery area. Good question. But Columbus and his wife, lived their entire life in Spocott, and they were free to go. But and that was true of a lot of the slaves. A lot of the slaves stayed because apparently they were comfortable there.
How did John Columbus get that last name? I thought the last name usually was the quote-unquote owner.
You mean the Wheatley? Yeah, actually, I'm in the middle of researching this right now. I have a black woman that I've connected with in Dover who is descended from the Wheatley family, and she did a DNA test, and she is related to not only the white Wheatleys, but Columbus. So we're hoping that we can kind of go back and find out where the name came from.
Were Wheatley's neighbors, or?
There were Wheatleys all over the Eastern Shore.
Oh.
There were Wheatleys up in Kent County, Queen Anne County,
Wasn't
Dorchester.
there a well-known poet or poetess, Phyllis Wheatley?
I don't know. Good question.
Oh, black.
Good question.
I don't know that, I think.
Yeah, I am by nature not a historian. Like I said, I'm a science teacher. You can't live in my grandfather's shadow and not be a historian in a sense. So, this is where, things that you all pick up and questions you ask are going to be fascinating to me. And in many cases, I won't know the answer, but I'm going to internalize a lot of questions. Yeah, I'd love to know more about his background because, one of the tragedies of slavery is that not only was their freedom taken away, but their history was taken away. Particularly because they couldn't read and write or weren't allowed to read and write. The Civil War changed everything, and you're going to see how the Civil War plays prominently in my grandfather's life. Two of his uncles, these were the two that helped my great-grandfather build ships. They both were Confederate sympathizers. Nehemiah on the left was killed during the war. William Harris, who was a prominent businessman in Dorchester County, was not allowed to enlist because he had an appendicitis attack and apparently was medically unqualified, but he was very much a Confederate sympathizer and harbored slaves. And was there was a story where once he was actually stopped going into Cambridge by the sheriff, and he had a Confederate spy, with him at the time. And the sheriff asked, "Who is it?" And he said, "Oh, it's a Confederate spy." And the sheriff laughed and went on, not thinking this. But he apparently, interesting times. So my great-grandfather was the military person, and ironically, he chose not to fight, which we think is another clue that he was very much of an abolitionist. He very much was anti-slavery, but also very much for preserving the Union. But they broke up at this point, and for about 20 years, he and William Harris couldn't even talk. But apparently, they were able to patch up differences. And of course, we see this in a lot of families. The Civil War just tore families up. In some ways, like what's happening today, where we get family members that are polarized. So it's there's some real parallels today. This woman married Columbus Wheatley. This woman, if I had to hop in a time machine and go back, she would be one of the three people that I want to see. And you will be in her house. She married Columbus. She was phenomenal. There's a story about her, which I'm going to wait and save on the tour, that's sort of unbelievable, where she actually had an impact on high-level state politics. This is a woman that couldn't read or write because there was no opportunity to. But my grandfather being child number 19, you can envision he kind of got lost in the shuffle. And he very much was raised by her, loved his mother dearly, but I heard far more stories about this woman than I did about my great-grandmother.
What did he call her?
Everyone called her Aunt Adeline, and Columbus was called Uncle Columbus, and I'll talk about this in the last session. We sort of look at that as a derogatory term today, but it very much was not a derogatory. She was family, and once again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the last session. But my grandfather gave her. He was the only one who gave her a eulogy at her funeral when she died 27, and I know how much she endured her. But like I said, I'll tell you a couple really neat stories, but not today. Keep a little suspense going here. This is neat. My grandfather was George Loving Pierce Radcliffe. To the day he died, he had no clue where that name came from. This was, Bob, you may have heard about this from my father, because this was one of my father's, searches. His grandfather died in 1974. No one had any idea where the middle name came from. George didn't have the nerve to ask his father. His father was a very loving person, but very stern, very serious. His mother really didn't know, but said it may have come from a book that somebody was reading. And that's kind of all my grandfather knew. My mother, who was the least historically oriented person I've ever known, and she was a wonderful mother, but history was not her thing. But she was reading John Jake's North and South. And in one of the books, she ran across the name Lubbock Pierce. And my father wrote John Jakes. And through writing John Jakes, and then, of course, now with the internet, we can dig up the information. Lubbock Pierce was an abolitionist minister in Georgia. Somewhat abolitionist, because in Georgia, you couldn't be an abolitionist. If you freed a slave in Georgia, you were arrested. So there's nothing in it. In trying to continue what my father did, I did a lot of writing and tried to investigate, and there's no place where he's advocating freeing slaves. I'm not sure he could have, but there's some things that clearly smacked of abolitionists or treating slaves better. The fact that my great-grandfather put that in as a family name when there were a whole lot, you saw all the family ancestors, to pick that out of the air was kind of unusual back then. And obviously there was some connection. And we'll come back to that a little bit more and fill that in a little bit more in the third session. So, it's interesting things. One of the most significant things in my grandfather's life was that he was lying in bed at age 10, and his parents were in the other room talking, and he overheard them say, because they thought he was sickly, that he would never live to see age 21. You can imagine the impact that would have on a 10-year-old child. And you'll see how that plays out in my grandfather's life. He was terrified, but my grandfather said, and rather than getting depressed about it, he decided to do something about it. He started running everywhere. And people said, there's a picture of him actually running around Spocott. People actually said that my grandfather ran everywhere. We had to go to another house half a mile away. Running became a big deal, and you'll see that plays into his life also. His education was really unusual. His real education were books. This is a photo of a book that was given to my grandfather on his 10th birthday. Plutarch's Lives of the Ancient Greeks and Romans. Did anybody ever have to read that in school? My senior year? Oh my Lord. I could, it's complex. And this is a 10-year-old child, and this is his present, and he loved it. It was a treasure. So, obviously, even by age 10, reading was a big deal, and reading history was a big deal. Once again, it's going to be a clue to what's coming. And neither of his brothers were that way. They always used to joke that they were out there doing all the work and he was sitting inside reading. And it made for some fun, lovable rivalry between them. He also celebrated Christmas 365 days a year. Christmas was the big deal at Spocott. And he always said, when does the preparation for Christmas begin? He would always say December 26th, because that was the day he ordered the seed for the popcorn that he would grow that he would use to decorate the tree. And the whole year was preparing for this unbelievable day when everybody would descend. Everybody that lived on the property would descend, because Spocott was just one big, humongous family. Of course, Spocott is a beautiful property because anything you want on Spocott, the cedar trees, the bayberry, the holly, everything was grown right there. So it was, they were kind of surrounded by Christmas. A little bit more on his schooling. He was homeschooled. It's actually a picture of him. He's the one actually sitting on the lap of the governess that they hired. Even though he had a great-grandmother, they hired a governess to basically educate all the kids in the school. The funny thing is that the great-grandfather, or his father, had built a school, you'll see that on the tour, basically for his kids, and George made it through one day because he was deemed too sickly to go to school. And once again, he's sickly team plays a lot through his life. So even though his father had built this school, he ended up being homeschooled, but he did go to high school.
Did they
Yes.
teach the black children there too?
No, they were taught separately, but they were taught Adeline and Columbus. There were two black families that lived on there. Once again, we'll talk about this on the tour. And their children were educated, but they were not educated by the governess. Those were actually educated by my great grandmother. And of course, this is a theme we'll get into on the third session is there was a complete acceptance of the blacks as equals, but not equal enough that they would be educated together. So it's, that's where we get into, were they good people, bad people by today's standards? It's kind of hard to say. But so my grandfather really had one day of official education until he went to high school. Okay, this is another clip. The high school principal was Emerson Harrington, who became governor of Maryland. So when your principal and teacher becomes a future governor, you're going to see how that plays into later on. He was the only boy in the graduating class, and we actually have his report card. And his grades were good, but they weren't fantastic.
Why would he have been the only boy? Did most of the boys not?
They're just by chance in that point in time, there just were only girls, and it just was a small class. Most kids weren't. The problem with going to high school is you had to be, if you lived in the country, you had to be transported. And it's for him, he had to live with someone in town. There had to be a family member. But the bottom line is most people didn't go to high school. I mean, 8th grade was usually it.
The boys, they were expected to work on farms.
Right, exactly. And really, we think of Cambridge now as where everybody lives. Early on, Cambridge, for a lot of time, there were a lot more people living on the islands than there were in Cambridge. Cambridge was settled really about 100 years afterwards. So things were a little different than they are today. He had to take a year off because the family had no money. Everyone, to this day, everyone thinks the Radcliffes are wealthy. We own 250 acres of land. I have a letter from my great-grandmother written to that went to all the family members, and this is when my grandfather was 15 years old, saying he had no winter coat. Could anybody help out with getting a winter coat? We had a farm and everything, but shipbuilding and farming back then wasn't paying. And of course, it wasn't shipbuilding back then. So he couldn't afford to go to college, but then a relative did pay for him to go to Hopkins. He did teach at Cambridge High School for a while, once again, with Emerson Harrington, future governor there, so that relationship continued. But he was able to get through Hopkins in 3 years. He always jokingly said he was laughed at because the only freshman to show up in shorts the first day. I assume he had something besides shorts, but he was one of the younger people in the class. But very fond memories of Hopkins. He would receive a scholarship, a full expensive scholarship to attend the grad school at Hopkins. It was a combination of history and, well, it was primarily history. He completed the PhD program in 3 years, but this is where his love of running kicked back in. He'd always done the running, and he was actually he was a very hard worker, so it never occurred to him to go out for an athletic program, but the track coach saw him and said, you're an amazingly good runner.
He's running between classes.
Just running, yeah, exactly, just running everywhere. And so they put him on the team. He was part of the 1898 Penn Relay team. Penn Relays that was the big, on the East Coast, that was the big running event, and they won the the mile relay and was given a gold watch.
It still is, isn't it?
It still is a big deal, but it was particularly big deal back then. And you know, there he is, and you know, just sort of a goofy looking kid, you know, shy. But pieces were starting to sort of come together. But as you'll see, that watch was his prized possession. His house could have burned down. He wouldn't have cared as long as he had the watch. It was that important to him. Graduate work. This is another amazing coincidence. His PhD dissertation was on Governor Thomas Hicks in the Civil War. Once again, the Civil War coming back. Who was his faculty advisor? Woodrow Wilson. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. Now, Wilson had graduated, gotten his degree from Hopkins, but he was at Princeton at the time. But he was coming back and teaching courses at Hopkins, and loved my grandfather's, research that he was doing, and it basically became a co-mentor of the research project. My grandfather picked up it was a fascinating topic, because what my grandfather was looking at is, why didn't Maryland secede from the Union?
Right.
And really, if everything had been allowed to go according to the way the legislature was, Maryland would have seceded. But because Hicks basically pulled a couple slick political moves, including moving the meeting out to Frederick, where a number of people didn't make it, there weren't enough votes to secede. My grandfather, because Hicks was from Dorchester County, my grandfather was able to get all of Hicks's records from the family. So he did this. I mean, you're going to see in a second why his book is still used. It's sort of amazing that 120 years to quote. He gave all the family records back to the Hicks family. They lost them. Years later, no one in the Hicks family could basically unearth those records. So my grandfather's book happens to be the only real insight into what was going on in Maryland and in the governor's mind.
His dissertation?
His PhD dissertation was published a year later, and it's been republished actually. Like I said, it's still used.
Oh, yeah.
But the fact that he connected with Woodrow Wilson, and once again, he loved Woodrow Wilson's style of teaching. One of the things that my grandfather hated is kind of what I'm doing right now, which is a lecture, because basically even high school back then was professor just one way firing information. Woodrow Wilson had a more interactive style and would deal with controversial things, and my grandfather loved the fact that his classes were much more dynamic, and it's also what directed my grandfather towards teaching, as you'll see. Yeah.
How could he, if Woodrow Wilson was already at Princeton at that time, how could he be teaching classes?
He was coming to Princeton. Every year he would teach a whole series of classes. I guess it was a class a week. He had to be going back and forth between Princeton.
I mean, commuting wasn't quick or easy.
No, Princeton is that's you got to get across the Delaware River back then.
That's a long trip.
I was sort of flabbergasted. I don't think my father even knew this, but when I dug into some of my grandfather's things and realized that this connection, we don't have any letters or anything from Wilson, but we have some of my grandfather's comments on, in his letters, comments on his teaching style and whatnot. But yeah, you can see if you go back into Johns Hopkins history that he would teach this series of classes basically on history and economics. And apparently very popular classes because the students loved, it wasn't the same old boring drudgery, an hour and a half of just taking notes. When my grandfather graduated from Hopkins, once again, Wilson, I want to be a teacher. My grandfather became not only a teacher, but they made him principal, because a lot of teachers back then didn't even have a college education. So he became principal of Cambridge High School for a year, taught Latin, which he loved. He could quote Latin passages in the 70s that, you know, he remembered from 1901. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast yesterday, so I'm not sure I'm my grandfather's grandson. When he left, you know, apparently the girls were absolutely madly in love with him, and they wrote this little poem that we have, basically just telling him how, you know, they called him Georgie.
Well, even I remember in high school when you had a young, handsome man or beautiful woman, everyone loved their class.
Yes. Having been a young male teaching myself, there's a good side, but there's a real bad side to it. You know, like, enough.
Leave me alone, run for the hills.
Yeah. So once again, you know, it's just the love of teaching, and you're going to see how that plays out in next session and how he was a United States Senator. He was not, because most senators were, you know, lawyers and businessmen. Even though my grandfather, you'll see, had a law degree, he was really a teacher. And a teacher in the Senate is a sort of an odd duck, as you'll see. He was immediately recruited to be a teacher at Baltimore City College. He taught there, once again, for just 1 year. 3 years, he taught freshmen. 3 years later, the class dedicated their yearbook to him. Well, that's unusual, that when you sit down to dedicate your yearbook, that a teacher that was only in your school 1 year, 3 years ago, he kept in such close contact with that class that he attended every one of their reunions except for one or two. And actually, a couple weeks before he died, he was at their reunion where most of them had died off. One of his students was Edward Everett Horton. If you're a fan of old movies, he was a character in a lot of old movies, and you know, there's some we have some interesting letters from him and comments about my grandfather as a teacher. Thought the world of my grandfather, but also used to say that, you know, they were always playing practical jokes on it too. So anyway, my grandfather at that point decided he loved history, but teaching it was one thing, but he thought he had to go to another level. Teaching it was great, but he felt with teaching, you're living in the past. As a lawyer, he could affect history. And that's kind of what drove him into that. He completed 3 years of law school in 1 year. Once again, here's another clue. His two classmates, or not two classmates, there's two roommates. They lived in a boarding house in Dorchester, or in Baltimore. One was Philip Lee Goldsboro, who became governor and senator. And the other was Sam Dennis. Name you might not be familiar with, but in the Baltimore legal community, he was a giant. He was a chief judge at the Supreme Bench, and some of the stories about him are just amazing. I could go on forever, but I won't.
Is Goldsboro from Talbot County?
I think he may have been partly Talbot County and partly Dorchester. He's connected sort of with both counties, but I think you're right. I know he's on the Eastern Shore, and I remember looking that up one time, and it left. He wasn't a Cambridge resident, so I think you're probably right. I think it was either Talbot or Caroline, but I suspect it was Talbot. But to be in a room with, if you can imagine the conversations that would have gone on, and of course, Goldsboro had he was a Republican, very different ideas from my grandfather. So and Sam Dennis was as outspoken and much of a practical joker. It must have been a really exciting room. And I have a feeling that 1 year of living in that would have made a huge difference. The one story that comes out of this, and it's a funny story, and it tells you a little bit about my grandfather, and I don't even know whether I've got it on the slideshow or not. Apparently, one morning, my grandfather got up from this apartment and he was walking to law school, and he was stopped, and someone tapped him on the shoulder and knew who he was and said, "Mr. Radcliffe, are you wearing the fact that you don't have any pants on?" And my grandfather told that story on himself, but he was incredibly absent-minded, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. He out of law school, he got a job with the American Bonding Company, which ended up merging with Fidelity Deposit Company. It was a surety firm, never pronounced that right. But basically issuing bonds. He very quickly became vice president. This is what's amazing about my grandfather. This is what makes me feel like I couldn't possibly be descended from him. By age 26, all of this had happened by the time my grandfather was age 26. Okay, he had a PhD, he had a law degree, he taught for 2 years, his book was published, and here he is becoming a vice president of a very prominent American Bonding Company at that time was the largest bonding company in the country. Now, there were several ways, but all of this happened by the time he's age 26.
What did a bonding company do back then?
What it does today, if you're putting up, somebody has to put up the money for a project, and basically it's an insurance deal because they're putting up the money and they're taking the risk that the project will fail. Some of you may know that finances and economics are my weak point. And that's one thing that I left out of the book, largely because I wasn't competent to really deal with that.
It's interesting that is the business or industry, if you will, that you would get involved in.
Well, yeah, it is. It is, because the finance side isn't, obviously, as a lawyer, it was a job. But with considering all of his history, background and whatnot, it would seem a little bit unusual. That's the one thing that kind of doesn't make sense.
But he loved it, he stayed there his whole life, right?
Yeah.
But wasn't he also in Confield, he was also became a politician during that period, right?
Right. You'll see how this plays out. One of the fascinating stories, his second treasure in life was this little bronze lion right here. He was right there, their office building was right in the middle of the Baltimore fire, and he literally spent an entire day with the fire heading towards the building, running up and down stairs, no elevator. He was the only one because it was the weekend, carrying materials. He had a couple of people that got to help, but they basically moved all the files out of the office. And his last trip up there, he went by the president's office and found this bronze lion, and he carried it down, weighed 35 pounds. At that point, the horse and cart had gone, so he had to literally carry it a mile through Baltimore in the middle of the night. Which had to be a little bit comical at that point, how he had the energy to do it. But he just treasured that. And sadly, that was stolen. And I'll tell you a little bit about that, I guess, on the tour.
George, it said that was one of his 2 prized possessions.
The gold watch.
Oh.
The gold watch. My grandmother, the most unusual person I have ever met in my life. She was different. I could talk for an hour and a half about her. She was assistant editor of Ladies' Home Journal at age 21. That was the largest magazine circulation in the country. Just phenomenally talented, but very eccentric views. Early advocate of women's suffrage and population control, particularly population control, to where she actually wrote a book that was nationally distributed, basically saying that the key to human health and survival was abstinence from sex. Unfortunately, I still have about 20 or 30 copies of that, which probably ought to be burned in our backyard. But she was a wonderful but she obviously had a significant influence on him. It was clear who wore the pants in the family. He was a shy kid. There was nothing about her that was shy, but she was just remarkable and very different. One of the stories, their house was robbed twice in Baltimore. Both times the burglar was put in the hospital. She was interesting. Like I said, I could talk about her. There's a chapter on her in the book. Some of the stories about her I almost don't believe. They suffered a lot of tragedy. My grandmother's brother committed suicide. Her father died shortly thereafter, and my grandfather and grandmother lost their first child, and that really, my father grew up in the aftermath of that, so he ended up being the most overprotective child in the history of mankind. My grandfather probably wasn't home as much as he should have been. He was very loving and caring, and he was there, but clearly my grandmother took over, and it probably made for, my grandfather and grandmother loved each other dearly, but it had to have been the most interesting marriage. I even, as a child, knew that they were a little different.
I have a question about the sanitarium. What did back in those days, when she were to go into a sanitarium for treatment, what would that be? Was that relaxation?
A sanitarium was more than relaxation. It was treatment, and in most cases it was voluntary. You just put yourself in for a while.
But what kind of treatment would it be?
She was dealing with severe anxiety from all the losses, and she just at times couldn't handle it, and she would check herself.
So would there be like psychologists or psychiatrists?
We actually have some letters from her psychologist, basically. But I think it was part relaxation too, because one of them was west in Baltimore, and she talked about it as if it was almost a vacation.
Yeah.
But there was a psychologist involved.
Because we don't hear that term used much today.
No, it's a very negative term, and she would end up as a result of this become nationally prominent in advocating better treatment for the mentally ill.
Yeah. Well, interesting though too, it's that term, that type of organization does exist in Europe. Because our goddaughter's mother, after having a bout of cancer, ended up spending several months at a sanitarium in Germany.
Well, we still
that
have
cared for her, and I thought of it more as
we still have facilities like that. For one of my best friends, her daughter died. She was getting a divorce, and it was a very hectic time for her. And one morning she was combing her hair and it didn't come out right. And she started to cry and she couldn't stop. And so that was her breakdown. And so she went, and had a nervous breakdown somewhere, and they helped her, and she's fine now.
And this is a problem that I had in going through all of this, not just this, but it's hard to put ourselves in the position of the person because the times were so different. Bob?
Just another option. I thought that it was also for TB.
Yeah, that's what I associate. So treatment for that.
Right.
Well, I know that my aunt was institutionalized in New York for TB during that same period. And that was the common treatment for women of that.
Right, and for several diseases. One of my other great-grandparents on my mother's side was institutionalized her whole life. She never raised her children, my other grandmother at all. And that was for a kidney-related disease. And for a lot of diseases now, because of the lack of medication, there were frequently serious mental, side effects. Interesting time. Let's see.
It was not a time to be living in if you weren't healthy, I guess.
This is probably the most significant piece of being in the right place at the right time. My grandfather was chairman of the War Records Committee. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. He was too old to fight in the war, so there was a program called the $1 a Year program, where anyone with legal or serious business experience would volunteer for $1 a year to help out with the federal government. Because his father had been a shipbuilder, he said, well, I'm going to do volunteer work for the Department of the Navy. Undersecretary of the Navy at that time was Franklin Roosevelt. They became very close friends. And if there were ever, a flashing sign that you're headed for a political career, this may have been it right here. Roosevelt was very influential.
This was prior to his contracting polio.
Correct, and I'll actually deal with that. When Roosevelt lost the vice presidential bid, my grandfather immediately went to the president of the bonding company or Fidelity Deposit at that time and said, you got to hire this guy. And they hired Roosevelt my grandfather kind of headed up the Baltimore office, and then Roosevelt was going to head up the New York office. The Baltimore office was the main office. The New York office was secondary. So later on, people were actually able to refer to my grandfather as once having been President Roosevelt's boss. Not that they ever considered it that way. And of course, that summer, 1921, right, at the election, that summer is when Roosevelt contracted polio. My grandfather was at his bedside at least once a week for almost a year. He was constantly, traveling down there. And it's interesting because I'm looking at how my grandfather talked about it. In the beginning, it was worrying about his friend, but it started evolving into the two of them talking about, we've got to do something about it. Roosevelt was a very upbeat, forward-thinking kind of guy, and never any self-pity. And basically the seeds for what became the March of Dimes literally got sown in a lot of the conversations that they had, and just some fascinating Roosevelt stories. I'll share a couple of them next week.
So polio was a pretty big issue.
It was the big issue. I remember one summer in Baltimore where no one went in the swimming pool. It was, we were that afraid of it. I learned how to swim the year before and forgot how to
I
swim.
remember that summer.
What would the year timeframe would be that,
Well.
55 was the year that I didn't go swimming.
Huh.
And, the vaccine was being discovered about that time, but it wasn't really distributed
I think
until
I was
really
like
the end
10,
of the
so it
50s.
would have been 1950.
yeah, because I was given that vaccination as a child.
So in 1950.
Epidemics were very local.
Yeah.
And
Right.
there was one summer, it would have been 49. I was down here, staying with an aunt and uncle in the house I now live in. And my father would not let me return to the aunt and uncle in Easton, Pennsylvania, where I went to public school. And it was because that Easton was having an outbreak. Now, that was 49. These little outbreaks tended
Right.
to be fairly local. And down here it was not an issue in 49, but it was in Easton, Pennsylvania. So I started first grade several weeks late.
Right.
It was an issue in New York City in 49.
Was it?
Yeah.
Because my cousin got it.
Okay.
But you're right. Like I said, as a 6-year-old kid in 1955, I really wasn't aware of anything other than you're not going swimming this summer.
Wow.
And interestingly, I remember closed pools, chlorine is almost as specific for the poliovirus. Now, of course, all the socializing around the pool, and everybody was sitting around.
Yeah, I mean, nobody really
But
knew
the
what was
pool
going
itself was not a problem,
Yeah.
but we didn't know that then.
And no, it's an interesting time. So anyway, these are the 15 things that I just think, at this point, my grandfather's path in life was pretty much set, because all of these things are going to play out. I'm going to stop for a second. We've got about 15 more minutes. I was pretty sure I wasn't going to get through all of this, but that's fine, because we're doing exactly what I want to do. I love your comments and discussions, and there's more than enough time in the next two sessions to let these kind of overrun. So keep interrupting with questions. I'm in no hurry. Anyway, like we said, 1921. That really, his focus on his friend, and they stayed close friends. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. It had a significant influence on him, and particularly, my grandfather stayed committed to this. They started running, and this is once again polio related. They started running what were called birthday balls. And what would happen is they would run on Franklin Roosevelt's birthday, which I think is the end of January, I want to say the 31st. They would have a birthday ball, and they would use that to raise money for polio research. And of course, my grandfather immediately got involved in that, and he was running the Baltimore and Washington were the two big ones, and he was running the Baltimore one. He worked on this over the years and really evolved this into a monster event. And this is where he did some things which sort of had, some political savvy involved. It started as just a one event, to where there were 5 or 6 of them around the city of Baltimore, and attended by as many as 15,000 people, and making tons of money. What my grandfather did is he dipped into Hollywood. One of his distant cousins was Dorothy Lamour. And apparently he used Dorothy Lamour to sort of get in, and he started pulling in, big names from Hollywood. This was Eleanor Powell, if you're familiar with the dancer, actress. We have a photo of the two of them kissing, which we used for years to torment, my grandfather. They had a wonderful relationship, and he brought her back several years. But Mickey Rooney and all those people he would bring over, and of course that's where they were able to bring in 15,000 people. But just built this up into a monstrous thing, which very quickly then evolved into the March of Dimes. That Roosevelt founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which became the March of Dimes. My grandfather headed up the Maryland branch of that organization almost until the day he died. He was still the chairman in his 90s. That's how committed he was to this cause. That's actually my father. Probably recognize that. My grandfather got involved. He was always referred to as Mr. Chairman, close friend of Theodore McKeldin, who was both governor of Maryland and mayor of Baltimore for 2 terms. Talk about him next week too. Made the comment, I'm trying to list him as the greatest chairman in Maryland history, and you'll see what I mean. My grandfather was considered an incredible organizer. Very quiet behind the scenes. He knew how to organize things, and you'll see next week where that organization skill came from, because a lot of it came from, a couple positions that he held early on. But he was also very good at connecting projects with funding. And just to give you an idea what this man was involved in, this is the chairmanships and the presidencies that he was involved in at age 78. I am 5 years from that. I couldn't do that right now if my life depended on it. I mean, at some of this Maryland Historical Society, that was a full-time job, even though it was considered volunteer at the time. Just all of this stuff that he was involved in. And, you know, he was the busiest person, literally, that I have ever
Consider
seen.
he did law school in 1 year,
And yeah,
and he did his PhD.
well, yeah, I mean, this was,
78.
yeah.
Well, yeah.
A lot less.
I mean, I look at that and that's crazy, but every year was like that. Now, he slowed down in his 80s and he was only involved in like 8 or 9 things. I mean, it was kind of crazy. But when they founded the Salk Institute, once again polio related, he was asked at age 86 to be one of the trustees for that. And he had the same problem that my father did. He couldn't say no.
Do you know what the WHAM program advice, that was Channel 13 in Baltimore.
Right, very good.
I'm from Baltimore, so.
Good. I know Channel 13 well, but I actually have forgotten that. That's very good.
Yeah.
It's exhausting even thinking.
Liquor is not cooking. Try it.
He must have done a great.
There we go. President of the Maryland Historical Society, he's the longest serving, and of course, with his history background, how logical that he be involved with that organization. He joined almost right out after law school. In the beginning, he referred to it as a bunch of old guys still fighting the Civil War. Because he said whatever was on the agenda, it became the group, and it was, once again, old white men. It was, you know, almost a social organization. And they would sit there and they would argue this, and then he got disgusted with that. Over the course of, you know, he was an officer for over 60 years, president for 25 years. He oversaw the transformation of that to a completely different organization that pretty much it is today, although they changed their name. And really developed the organizational structure and the outreach to the community, the connection with the schools. He very much hated the fact that it was an old white man's group and just wanted to see it diversify, and it did. Very influential. Sadly, when I'm doing my research of the Maryland Historical Society, the younger people up there didn't even know who it was. You know, I understand it's been a long time, but it shows that today, in a lot of areas, we're kind of forgetting how it all got started, what the roots are. And, you know, we see that in a lot of things.
Did he live in Baltimore when he was doing
Lived
it?
in Baltimore at the time, yeah, because the American Bonding or the Fidelity Deposit was in Baltimore.
Yeah.
But he was all over the place. I'll give you a little sneak preview of that in a second.
Live in Baltimore.
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
Where do you live?
Yes.
Lived in Roland Park. Do you know where the Baltimore Country Club is? He was
That's where I live.
literally right across the road from the Baltimore Country Club. And I grew up not far from there. I grew up on, you're familiar with that area?
On the corner, very close to Gilman.
Yeah, I went to Gilman.
Yes,
So did my father, yeah.
yeah.
Well, I went to Poly, so I.
There you go. Poly, I always thought of Poly as a better school than Gilman. The Poly A course back then was considered
It was very-
the premier.
it was very-
Gilman was nice, but it was, you know, it was for rich white kids, and I didn't like the snobbery that I ran into that I doubt you would have seen at Poly.
It wasn't very-
I would have been Gilman was a good school, but I would have been much happier at Poly. I was not, much to my father's disgust, because he was more in the Baltimore Society. I was very much, you know, I want to earn my reputation on my achievements, not because I happen to be descended from a United States Senator. But anyway, he you know, this very proud of his organization. Governor Tawes in '59, and once again at this point, he's quite up there in years, appointed him chairman of the Civil War Centennial Committee and in Maryland, and got very heavily involved with that. That had him all over the East Coast. But interesting enough, now that Harriet Tubman's in the news, Dorchester County Historical Society, and they don't have any record of this, but I have this from a couple reliable sources, part of the community approached in early 1960s, the Dorchester County Historical Society to get money to put up some recognition for Harriet Tubman, and they refused to do it. So my grandfather went out and, being head of the Civil War Centennial Committee, researched and found her connection to the Civil War, which was significant. And that was, there's a state road marker, which is still there today. That was the first bit of recognition for her. So kind of an interesting connection there. Historical preservation, let me see what time we got.
Yeah, 3 minutes.
3 minutes. You know, this might be a good place to stop and pick up. And this is the part that will kind of blow you away, because you will not believe the things that you have visited that wouldn't be there if it weren't for him. I was surprised personally, but with his background and his mother's influence, he just was about preserving history in every little bit of it, whether it's written or monument. And, you know, we had an old house we want to tear down on our property, and it was historical. It wasn't going to happen. So this is a good place to pick up next week, and we'll wrap this up, and then we'll jump into his political life and the Roosevelt connection and Harry Truman connection, as you'll find out. He and Harry Truman were very close, and his political life is interesting because it contrasts seriously with politicians today, as you'll find.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yes.